The first thing I checked before the chandeliers, or the seating charts, or the ice sculptures shaped like the Cross Group logo was every exit in that ballroom. I counted them without meaning to. For doors, 2 loading corridors, 1 fire stair behind a velvet curtain nobody but me seemed to know existed. I had been doing this for 9 years, and I still told myself it was just good facilities work. "My name tag," said Elena Cole. I answered to it so easily now that most nights I forgot there was another name underneath it, folded up small like a photograph nobody was allowed to look at anymore. I checked the sight lines from the catering doors to the stage, the way the crowd would bottleneck near the bar once the toast started, the distance from the coat check to the nearest stairwell. None of it was in my job description. All of it was in my hands before I even thought to stop them. I ran a crew of 6 that night, prepping the Cross Tower Ballroom for a shareholder gala tied to the company's upcoming public offering. I liked the overnight shifts best before the guests arrived, when the room still belonged to the people who actually kept it running. I liked knowing exactly where every wire, every fire panel, every locked door led. It made the world smaller and safer, even if only for a few hours. I was wearing my jacket over my uniform that night, the way I always did on setup shifts. It used to belong to a man named Ray, who taught me how to read a burning building the way other people read a room. He'd been gone 3 years by then, but the jacket still smelled faintly of the cedar soap he used, underneath the smoke that never fully washed out. It was scorched at one cuff, the leather gone stiff there, and I kept meaning to replace it and never did. It wasn't sentiment, or not only sentiment. It was habit. A trained hand does not let go of the tool that once saved it. I was running a final walkthrough of the ballroom floor when Damian Cross came in early, a full hour before his own event director expected him, trailed by 2 assistants trying to keep pace and failing. I had seen him from a distance before, in elevators, in hallways, in the framed photograph near the lobby security desk. Up close, he moved like someone constantly aware of how many people were watching him, which meant he never fully relaxed. Not even in an empty room with nobody in it but staff. He stopped when he saw me, not because I was doing anything wrong, because my jacket didn't match the black and silver uniforms of the rest of the crew, and that was apparently enough to end his morning. He asked his events director, in a voice pitched to carry across the room, whether the venue was now accepting thrift store donations as staff attire. He didn't look at me while he said it. That was somehow worse than if he had. I was a problem to be solved without ever becoming a person in the room, a stray detail in an otherwise flawless space he needed flawless tonight, because the investors deciding whether to greenlight his company's public offering did not forgive imperfect optics. I didn't answer. I never did. Not for comments like that. I logged it the way I logged everything, filed it somewhere quiet, and went back to counting exits. My crew looked at me sideways, waiting for a reaction I wasn't going to give them. I had learned a long time ago that silence cost less than pride. There's a particular kind of quiet you learn when you've spent 9 years making sure nobody looks at you twice. You stop reacting to insults the way other people do, because a reaction is a fingerprint, and fingerprints get people found. I had trained myself so thoroughly out of visible feeling that most days I forgot I still had any underneath it. Standing there while he talked about thrift store relics, I cataloged the exact pitch of his voice, the width of his shoulders under a jacket that cost more than my monthly rent, the way his eyes swept the room and never quite landed anywhere long enough to rest. Old habits. Triage habits. You learn to read a scene fast when reading it slow can cost someone their life. But something in his voice snagged on a hook I couldn't name. A rasp low in his throat like scar tissue talking. I told myself it was nothing. I had learned, the hard way, not to trust the things my memory tried to hand me unprompted. Memory had betrayed me before. I preferred facts I could check against a floor plan. Here's a question I want you sitting with before we go any further, because I promise you it matters later. If a man who once needed saving stood in front of you and had no idea it was you who saved him, would you tell him, or would you let the silence keep you both safe? The doors opened at 7. Guests came in on a wave of perfume and cold outside air, tuxedos and gowns, and the particular loudness of people who had never once had to check where the exits were. Somewhere in that wave was a heavy-set man in his 60s with a private security badge clipped to his jacket and eyes that moved over faces the way mine moved over exits. His name, I would learn later, was Frank Marsh. He had spent most of his career with the state police, working a case that never closed, looking for a woman the file listed as dead. He walked into that ballroom already looking for a ghost, and he had no idea the ghost was standing 40 feet away, holding a tray of place card with someone else's name stitched into the fabric of her jacket. If you love a heroine who says nothing and remembers everything, hit subscribe right now, because Elena's silence was about to get very loud. The gala moved the way galas always move, in waves of small talk and clinking glass. And underneath it, two currents were building that had nothing to do with each other yet. One belonged to a woman with a tablet, an outside auditor brought in to check the cross group's books before the public offering went through. She sat at a side table with a laptop open, cross-referencing filings nobody in that room had thought about in years. Somewhere in the stack, she found an insurance payout from 9 years back that didn't sit right against the paperwork on record, a warehouse fire, numbers that didn't reconcile. She flagged it with a yellow sticky note and moved on to the next folder, not knowing she had just reopened a wound Damien had spent a decade keeping sealed shut with pure force of will. The other current belonged to Frank. He crossed the room with the unhurried patience of a man who had waited a long time for one specific moment, stopped a few feet from me near the dessert table, tilted his head like he was checking a photograph against a face, and said my name. My real name, loud enough that 3 people near the chocolate fountain turned around to see who he was talking to. I felt it hit me like cold water down the back of shirt. My hand stayed steady around the tray. My face stayed still, out of 9 years of practice, and I told him he had the wrong person, that my name was Elena Cole, that I worked facilities for the venue and nothing more. He didn't believe me. I could see it in the way his eyes stayed locked on mine a beat too long. But Damien was close enough to hear it too, standing near the bar with a glass he wasn't drinking from, and something in his expression shifted from irritation to a kind of focus I didn't understand yet, like a man hearing a song he half remembered from childhood. Would you answer to a name you spent 9 years burying just to survive, or would you let it die quietly in that room? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I genuinely didn't know, standing there, which choice was the brave one. I got Frank to back off by threading through a cluster of investors and disappearing into the kitchen corridor, past the trays of unclaimed canapes, out through the loading door I checked twice already that night. I didn't stop moving until I was in my car in the parking structure with my hands shaking too hard to fit the key into the ignition on the first try. I looked down at the jacket cuff, at the old scorch mark, and for the first time in years, I let myself think about the building it came from instead of just the man who gave it to me. There was a program insert from the gala, still folded in my coat pocket. I pulled it out under the dome light. Stitched into the corner of the cross group letterhead was a small crest, understated, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, a stylized C wrapped around a torch. I had seen that exact crest before, burned into a warehouse door 9 years ago, on the night everything about my life changed shape and I stopped being the person whose name was on my birth certificate. The building I just spent 6 hours cleaning belonged to the same family whose insignia was scorched into my memory. That was the thought I sat with the whole drive home, hands too unsteady to trust fully on the wheel, radio off, city lights sliding past in silence. Damien's security pull on me came back empty in the worst possible way. Officially, Elena Voss died in a warehouse fire 9 years ago, listed alongside 2 other names on a report, closed for insurance purposes, and never reopened, which meant that Elena Cole, the woman his events director had hired 18 months earlier, was running on paper that didn't belong to anyone living. He didn't know yet that I was both women. He assumed I was a plant, sent by a rival family or a regulatory body to embed a liability inside his company right before the IPO closed. So he had me watched, quietly, thoroughly, the same way he handled every threat to something he was building, filed under business risk instead of anything personal. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was that I'd been pulled off overnight setup 2 days later and assigned to run facilities for a week-long investor retreat at a cross-owned property upstate, a lodge with too many fireplaces and not enough working plumbing, and that put me in the same rooms as Damian Cross for 7 straight days. It should have been unbearable. Instead, it was strange in a different way. On the second day, a heating system failed in the main lodge an hour before a dinner with 40 investors. Pipes groaning and the temperature dropping fast enough that someone would have noticed within the hour. I fixed it myself, working alone in a crawl space with a flashlight in my teeth, and got it running again before a single guest complained. Damien found out anyway, because that was the kind of thing he tracked. He came and found me afterward in the utility room, sleeves still rolled from the walkthrough, and asked with what sounded like real curiosity instead of performance, how I'd known exactly which valve to check first. I told him. He listened like the answer actually mattered to him, nodding at the right places, asking one good follow-up question instead of pretending to understand. It was such a small thing, 5 minutes in a room that smelled like rust and old insulation, and it complicated everything I'd already decided about him back in that ballroom. I noticed, over the following days, small things I hadn't expected. He remembered the names of the retreat's kitchen staff on the second day and used them correctly on the third. He never raised his voice at anyone who worked for him, even when a vendor's mistake nearly wrecked the schedule. He had a habit of standing slightly apart from every group photo, like a man who'd trained himself out of being easy to hit. None of it undid what he'd said to me in that ballroom. But it started to look less like cruelty and more like a man performing a version of himself he thought the room required, and underneath it, someone entirely different trying to stay hidden the same way I was. Frank Marsh caught me alone near the equipment shed the next afternoon, hands in his coat pockets against the cold, breath fogging in front of him. He told me the truth, or at least a version of it, which was that he wasn't police anymore and hadn't been hired by any government agency. The Cross Group's own outside auditors had brought him in privately to vet risk before the offering went public, cross-checking old names against old cases. Which meant the people hunting for Elena Voss and the people currently signing my paychecks as Elena Cole were now, somehow, the exact same organization, closing in from 2 directions I hadn't realized were connected. Smash that like button if you already don't trust the retired detective, because something about Frank's timing wasn't adding up, and neither was mine. That night, pulling old blueprints for a repair on a lodge's east wing, working alone by lamplight in a records room that smelled like dust and cedar, I found an insurance document buried in a maintenance file where it never should have been. It bore a signature, Damien's mother's signature, dated the same night as the warehouse fire. Proof, finally, that the Cross family had been connected to what happened that night, though not yet proof of how or why or what it had actually cost anyone involved. The document was stamped destroyed in block red letters across the top corner. It clearly hadn't been destroyed at all. I sat on the cold floor of that records room a long time afterward, holding paper that shouldn't have existed. Inside a family's house, I was supposed to be keeping warm for the winter and felt 9 years of careful hiding start to crack under the weight of one signature. The retreat gave me 5 more days in close range of a man I was increasingly unable to file away as simple. We fell into an easy rhythm without either of us choosing it, trading dry comments across long planning meetings, catching each other's eye at exactly the moment something absurd happened at the podium, the kind of quiet understanding that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with 2 guarded people recognizing the shape of another guarded person. He asked once offhand what I did before this job. I told him a version of the truth that wasn't a lie exactly, just incomplete, and he didn't push, which I appreciated more than I expected to. I want to be honest with you here, because I think this genre owes you honesty. Not every good thing that happened between us was born out of crisis. Some of it was just 2 tired people being decent to each other in a cold hallway at 11 at night, comparing notes on bad coffee and worse investors. And I think that's worth saying plainly before this story gets more complicated. It didn't last. On the 4th day, a board member's wife cornered me near the coat room, wine glass in hand, studying my face with the particular hunger of someone who has just placed a stranger. She said she recognized me from an old local news photo, something blurry, something about a warehouse fire years back and a medic who vanished afterward. She didn't say it as an accusation. She said it as gossip, already reaching for her phone, already imagining the story she'd tell at brunch next week. I nearly walked out that night. I had my coat half on, car keys already in my hand, calculating how far I could get before anyone noticed I was gone. Then Damien, who had no idea what she'd actually found, only that something in my face had gone wrong, shut the conversation down himself, quietly, efficiently, redirecting her attention with a comment about the auction items, in a way that protected me, without him understanding what he was protecting me from. The next part of this story is where Damien finally puts the fire in my face together, and I promise you, you do not want to skip it. Later that night, out on the porch, with the temperature dropping fast, and neither of us in a hurry to go back inside to the noise, he asked me a question that had clearly been building in him for days without his full permission. He asked where I'd been 9 years ago, in March, the exact month of the fire. He said it like it had slipped out sideways, like even he was surprised to hear himself ask it. I felt the floor tilt under the question. I gave him nothing, the same practiced nothing I'd given Frank in that ballroom, but it cost me more this time because some part of me had started wanting to give him something else. I told him I didn't remember specific months from that far back. It was, I think, the first outright lie I told him. That question sat between us for the whole drive back to the city the next morning, unanswered and impossible to take back. He hadn't consciously connected me to the medic yet. His instincts had gotten there before his mind allowed itself to follow, the way a hand remembers a hot stove faster than the brain can name the danger. I could feel him circling something he wasn't ready to name out loud, and I was terrified of what would happen the day he finally did. The danger, when it came from a different direction than either of us expected. 2 nights after we got back to the city, someone broke into the maintenance office where I'd stashed that insurance document, the one with his mother's signature, forcing the lock on a filing cabinet that had never once been touched in 18 months of me working there. It was staged to look like a rival family sniffing around cross-group secrets ahead of the IPO, papers scattered, nothing obviously missing. Damien treated it as a threat to his business, not yet as a threat to me personally, and that distinction mattered because it meant the two of us still weren't fully standing on the same side of this yet. This is the chapter where the real threat stops hiding in the shadows and starts hiding in plain sight. So hit subscribe now, because you're not going to see where it's actually coming from. The break-in shook something loose in me that I hadn't expected. I spent the next 2 nights barely sleeping, running through every person who'd had access to that filing cabinet, every camera angle the maintenance office didn't have, every version of the story that ended with someone I trusted turning out not to be trustworthy at all. I had built my whole life around controlling variables. This felt like standing in a room where the walls kept moving an inch every time I turned my back. Frank found me again a few days later, in the parking structure this time, looking rattled in a way I hadn't seen from him before, glancing over his shoulder twice before he spoke. He told me his real client wasn't the auditors after all. Someone inside the Cross family's own inner circle had hired him years earlier, long before the IPO was ever announced, specifically to locate Elena Voss. He wouldn't tell me who. I don't think he fully trusted his own answer yet, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely afraid. I sat with that for a long time after he left, engine off, hands on the wheel, watching the concrete pillars of the garage in my rearview mirror. The break-in and Frank's real assignment were connected. Somebody had been looking for me for years, quietly, patiently, long before a gala or a public offering ever gave them a reason to hurry. Frank handed me one more thing before he left that night, a photograph from the original fire scene, water-damaged at the corners, edges soft from age. It showed a woman in a jacket almost identical to mine, standing near the warehouse door in the seconds before everything went wrong. It wasn't me. That photograph took the ground out from under everything I thought I understood about that night. I had believed for 9 years that I was the only off-duty responder near that building, and that my one clear memory of the fire, blurred and half-formed as it had always been, showed Damien himself setting something alight near the loading door. I had built 9 years of hiding around that single fractured memory. The woman in the second jacket, Frank's notes revealed a few days later, wasn't a stranger. She was the Cross family's longtime attorney and fixer, dead now for years, and the person actually destroying records inside that warehouse the night it burned. Not Damien. I read that line 3 times before it fully landed, sitting alone in my apartment with every light on. Around the same time, working from his own end of the mystery with no idea I was working from mine, Damien pieced together a memory of his own. A masked medic pulling him out of a collapsing structure while flames closed the door behind them. A woman he'd assumed for 9 years had died, saving a low-level enforcer nobody important would have bothered risking their life for. That guilt was the real engine behind everything he'd done since. Every record he'd sealed, every question he'd shut down at the office, every wall he'd built around that entire year of his life. He wasn't protecting a crime he'd committed. He was protecting the memory of a woman he believed had died for him and never got the chance to be thanked. He's been protecting a dead woman's memory for 9 years, and I've been protecting myself from him for just as long. Tell me in the comments who you think breaks first, because I honestly didn't know anymore, and I was living it. We ended up at the maintenance office the same night, from opposite directions, both drawn there by the same unfinished thread, both telling ourselves separate reasons for coming back after hours. Neither of us planned it. I reached for the same file drawer he did, in the dark, working by the light of my phone, and our hands landed on top of each other before either of us said a single word. We stood there a moment too long before either of us moved, the beam of my phone throwing long shadows across the filing cabinets, both of us breathing like we'd run there instead of walked. Neither of us said the words that would have ended the mystery instantly. He described the medic who saved him, careful, almost reverent, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it. I described what I remembered of that night, testing him, watching his face for a flinch that never came the way I expected it to. We both felt the recognition arriving, slow and enormous, filling the small room like smoke, and neither of us was ready yet to say it out loud. I want to tell you plainly, if you've ever protected someone by lying to protect yourself, share this with someone who would understand exactly why Damien couldn't just say the truth out loud that night, and why I couldn't either. The reprieve didn't last. Within days, the auditor's earlier flag turned into something much bigger. Federal investigators issued a formal request for records tied to the old insurance filings, subpoenaing years of paperwork nobody at the Cross Group had touched since the fire itself, which meant the cover-up was no longer a family secret contained behind closed doors. It was a matter of record now, and his mother's name was attached to it publicly for the first time in 9 years, printed on a document that strangers in government offices were now free to read. Cornered by something he couldn't quietly destroy his way out of this time, Damien made a different choice than the one he'd have made a decade earlier. Instead of burying the records again, calling in favors, making the problem disappear the old way, he decided to find Elena Voss himself, before federal investigators or whoever inside his own family had been hunting her got there first. He had no idea he'd already stood inches from her in the dark 2 nights earlier, hands touching over a file, drawer neither of them had let go of fast enough. He gave the order to his new head of security that same night, pacing his office with the phone pressed hard to his ear, telling him to find her before this became a funeral twice. He said it without knowing the search would end up exposing someone standing much closer to him than he could have imagined, someone who had been in the room for nearly every important decision of his adult life. What his search actually uncovered wasn't a rival family or a government agency at all. It was Victor, the man who had stood at Damien's side for over a decade. The one person in that organization Damien had never once thought to question, the man who'd taught him half of what he knew about running a business built on other people's silence. 9 years earlier, it was Victor who gave the order that killed the fixer in that warehouse fire and buried the evidence, not to protect Damien, who was barely more than muscle back then, but to secure his own rise inside the family's power structure during a transition nobody outside the inner circle ever knew was happening. Victor had spent 9 years making sure the one surviving witness never resurfaced to complicate the story he'd built. And when I did, quietly under a new name, in a job his own organization had unknowingly hired me for, he was the one who quietly set Frank Marsh loose to find me again. I sat with the full shape of it for a long time after Damien told me, turning it over the way I once turned over a bad diagnosis, checking it from every angle for the one detail that might make it survivable. The man Damien trusted most in the world had spent 9 years hunting the one person who could unravel his story, and had done it so quietly that neither of us had ever thought to look at him twice. It is a specific kind of dread, learning that the danger was never a stranger. It was always someone standing close enough to hand you your coffee in the morning. Suddenly, a lot of things made sense that hadn't before. The board member's wife, who happened to place my face at exactly the wrong moment, seated at exactly the table Victor had arranged. The break-in staged to look like outsiders. Time to a week when Victor knew I'd be alone in that office. The speed with which my file had been flagged the very night of the gala, faster than any routine background check should have moved. None of it had ever been random. All of it had been Victor, moving pieces on a board only he could see the whole shape of. Everything you thought you understood about who was protecting who just flipped. And the next part is where it got dangerous for real. Victor found me before Damien did. He came to the facility's office late on a Thursday under the pretext of finishing my employment paperwork. Calm, unhurried, carrying a folder like this was any ordinary afternoon. He locked the door behind him without making a show of it, the click almost polite. Then he said my real name out loud, gently, like an old friend greeting me after a long trip, and that gentleness frightened me more than a shout ever could have. For the first time since that ballroom, the fear I felt had a face and a name attached to it, and somehow that made it easier to think clearly instead of harder. He talked. I let him. He told me things about that night I hadn't known, about the fixer, about the order he'd given, speaking with the calm precision of a man who believed, even now, that he'd done what needed doing. Victor kept talking, unhurried, almost fatherly, telling me the fire had been necessary, that the fixer had grown careless with things that could have ended the family a decade earlier, that I should understand, better than most, how a single night could be justified by everything it protected afterward. I didn't argue with him. Arguing wastes air someone might need later. I asked small questions instead, the kind that sound like curiosity and are actually just time, and let him fill the silence with exactly the details investigators would eventually need. Damien had already started piecing together Victor's financial trail by then, transfers and payments that didn't belong anywhere in the Cross Group's legitimate books, all leading back to the same 9-year-old cover-up, and he moved fast once he finally understood what he was looking at. But I want to be clear about something, because this genre likes to hand all the credit to the man who burst through the door at the last second. I was not standing there waiting to be rescued. I had spent 9 years training for exactly this kind of moment, reading a room the way I'd once read a burning building, and while Victor talked calm and certain of his own righteousness, I was already working the conversation away I'd once worked triage on a bad night, staying steady, keeping him talking, buying every extra minute I could, and reaching quietly into my pocket to start recording every word he said. If you clocked that I'd think my way out of this before anyone came bursting through that door, go ahead and hit that like button, because you know you're heroines, and you know they don't just wait around. Damien arrived in time to change the balance of the room, out of breath, having sprinted the last flight of stairs, but it was the recording already running in my pocket that actually neutralized Victor, turning his own calm confession into evidence no lawyer would ever be able to talk around. Nobody needed to throw a punch. Nobody needed to raise a weapon. The threat ended on paper and on tape, the same quiet, procedural way it had all started 9 years earlier in a warehouse full of documents somebody desperately wanted gone. In the middle of the fallout, with sirens already audible somewhere down the block, Damien said my name back to me. Not Elena Cole. Elena Voss. He said it slowly, deliberately, with 9 years of guilt and gratitude, and something else underneath it finally allowed to surface after being buried for so long it had started to feel permanent. It wasn't a stranger noticing something clever about me across a crowded room. It was a man who had spent 7 long weeks slowly earning the right to say my real name, and finally doing it in a room that still smelled like burnt coffee and fear. Sirens arrived not long after, for Victor, federal vehicles pulling up along a street. I'd cleaned trash off 100 times without ever imagining this. Standing in that office listening to them, I understood I now had a decision in front of me that scared me almost as much as the fire once had. I could stay hidden, safe, protected by everything that had just happened. Or I could testify and let the whole truth stand in daylight for the first time in 9 years, in front of strangers who would get to decide what to do with it. I chose to testify, not because Damien asked me to, but because Victor's own recorded confession gave investigators enough to understand the real chain of command that night, which meant I could finally clear my name without dragging Damien's mother into a courtroom for a crime she never knowingly committed. She had signed paperwork under Victor's direction years ago without ever understanding what it covered up, and once that came out clearly in the investigation, it lifted a weight off Damien that he'd been carrying so long it had started to feel like part of his personality instead of something he was allowed to put down. Should I have testified even though it meant risking everything I'd rebuilt, or should I have stayed hidden and safe? Tell me your honest verdict in the comments, because I still think about that choice some nights, even now. The IPO went ahead anyway, restructured, transparent in a way the Cross Group had never been before under any prior leadership, with Damien stepping forward publicly as the person who helped expose a wrongful death and an arson cover-up buried inside his own family's history. What could have destroyed the company instead became the thing investors respected him for, a story about accountability instead of concealment. Nobody handed him that ending. He built it himself, once he stopped spending all his energy protecting a lie that was never actually his to carry. As for the two of us, we didn't rush toward anything just because the danger was finally gone. I went on a quiet Tuesday months later to a courthouse office with too much fluorescent light and a line of people waiting for entirely unrelated paperwork, and signed the forms to legally reclaim my name. Damien came with me, not as anyone's rescuer, just as a witness to my signature, standing exactly where he needed to stand and nowhere he didn't, hands in his pockets, quietly proud in a way he didn't try to hide. Months after that, we built something ordinary together, which turned out to be the part I'd wanted most and hadn't let myself admit. I ran a new employee safety division inside the Cross Group, one I designed myself from the ground up, walking every building the company owned and marking every exit the way I once had for free, except now someone actually paid me to care that much. He let me run it without hovering, trusting my judgment the way he trusted almost no one else's, and some mornings I caught him watching me across a conference table with an expression I never once saw him wear in that ballroom. We chose each other slowly, in daylight, on purpose, over quiet dinners and long weekends and small ordinary arguments about nothing important, the way you choose something you plan on keeping for a very long time. Ray's jacket still hangs in my closet. I don't wear it to work anymore. I keep it for the nights. I want to remember exactly how far I came from the woman who used to count exits out of fear instead of habit. I signed my name that day, Elena Voss, on a line that had been waiting 9 years for me to fill in, ink still wet under the fluorescent light. And for the first time since the fire, the name didn't feel like a wound. It felt like something I was finally allowed to come home to. If Elena's ending felt like the one she actually earned, hit subscribe, because the next story waiting for you is just as impossible to walk away from.